and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm just going to share my screen and my presentation, and then we'll get started. It's a real pleasure to be here. I wish I was there in person, but it's lovely to be here, aided by technology, which of course is a lot of what we're talking about today. So I'm going to talk to you about AI in education, its benefits, and particularly the ethical dimensions of AI in education. Now, I always find it useful to frame any discussion about AI in education by the three lenses that I find very useful when I'm thinking and talking about AI in education. So the first lens is about how we use AI in education, the kinds of technologies that are used in schools, colleges, students' homes. The second lens is about helping people understand artificial intelligence, educating people about artificial intelligence, which is obviously extremely important and increasingly so as AI becomes much more of our world. And then thirdly, there's the way in which the increased use of AI in the workplace, in our lives, impacts on education systems and the ways in which we need to change what we teach, and how we prepare students for a world that is full of AI, and indeed how we upskill people already in the workplace in order to enable them to work effectively with artificial intelligence. But these three lenses are not mutually exclusive. They're not distinct, they're highly interconnected. The more that we are able to use technology in education that uses AI, the more we become aware of AI, the more we understand it, and the more we understand its implications for education. But very briefly, to set the scene, I'm just going to say a very short amount about the kind of ways in which AI is in education, AI is being used in education at the moment, really to make the point that this is not new. And so if we think about AI in education not being new, we can see that there's a whole range of different tools that have been around for quite a while. Here are some images that summarize some of the technologies that have been with us for a while. And so we have tools like this system built by a company called Alelo in the US called N-Skills. It's an on-screen avatar that you can have a conversation with in English, and the avatar will respond to you and help improve your speaking in English, improve your spoken English. Now, the system is obviously based on millions of data points about students learning English, and the avatar adapts to meet the needs of the individual student. But this system has been around for a number of years, and there are many others like it. And then there are systems that help teachers to find the right resources. So rather than adapting to an individual learner, these are technologies that adapt to the teacher's requirements and help them find the optimal resources for their students. And here's a system that I think is particularly interesting because it combines an on-screen character, just like that first English learning system. We see the character sitting in a chair on the screen. She's playing the role of a counsellor for students, and we see on the other side of the screen a student who is receiving the counselling session. And we can see that the system is collecting data about that student as they interact with the on-screen character. And this data is data about facial expressions, also data about what the student is saying, about how they are, about their movement, about the speed, the pitch of what they're saying, whether there are big silences. And so this real-time data about this student is also fed into the AI that informs what the counsellor says to the student. I think this system is particularly interesting because it combines a lot of different types of AI to support the student, from natural language processing to the analysis of learner data to inform the interactions that the counsellor, the artificially intelligent on-screen character counsellor, has with the student. But this system was started in 2014. So this is nearly 10 years ago. And so the main point I want to make in this little section of the talk is that AI is not new in education. It has been used for quite a number of years, but mainly by quite small groups of students. And of course, it's been quite expensive. What is new with the advent of ChatGPT is scaled, freely available, sophisticated artificial intelligence. And it is therefore important for us to think about what this kind of technology can do and the implications that it has for education. So let's take a quick look. Here we have ChatGPT. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. And it really is a way of introducing personalized teaching at the touch of a key. It's certainly not perfect, but it does bring the ability to provide personal interactions for students and for teachers to create those personal interactions using this technology. There are many issues with it, but let's just have a quick look at the kind of things that you can generate. So here what you're seeing is an activity, a set of practice questions rather for students who are studying a particular part of the science curriculum. And what we're seeing here is some practice questions that a teacher could use to set for a class. So it's generating content for that teacher's lesson. And here we've asked ChatGPT to turn those practice questions into an activity that students could do. Now, teachers could improve these, but it gives them a starting point, and that's very useful. And then we can ask ChatGPT to provide personalized feedback for students who are successful in completing the practice questions. And we can ask ChatGPT to provide feedback for students who have not been as successful and need a bit more help. So we can get a really nice variety. You can see different types of feedback. Here, actually, the first example was for students who hadn't done so well. The second example for students who are doing well. The point is you can ask this kind of technology to generate this personalized feedback. And so when we think about a tool like ChatGPT and the fact that it is freely available and scaled, then we can see that there are a range of different ways in which it can be very usefully used in education. And these are just a few of them. There are, of course, many more. So we can use it for summarizing text. That can be really useful if you've got a large amount of text. If you're a student, if you're a teacher, being able to summarize that text. You can ask students to learn from different ways in which the text is summarized, perhaps according to different styles. You can extract information from text. So you can help teachers extract key information from lots of publications that they may need to read. In the same way, you can help students extract key information and then discuss with them whether that key information is accurate or not, for example. This kind of technology can also infer. So you can ask the technology to interpret different aspects of a text that you give it to analyze. And one of the ways in which this technology can infer is concerning emotions. So the technology will extract what it believes to be the emotions being portrayed in a particular piece of text. Now, this is not very accurate because we know from years of work in artificial intelligence that in order to accurately interpret emotions, you need multiple data sources. So a piece of text alone is not going to be enough. But nevertheless, this is one of the features that is offered by ChatGPT. That raises some concerns, but it's also extremely interesting. And lastly, we can use a tool like this to transform a text. That can be incredibly useful when it comes to translating from one language to another, or restructuring a text, or making sure it's grammatically correct. Now, it's important to remember that what ChatGPT produces is not necessarily accurate, and it needs to be checked, but it can certainly save a lot of time for both teachers and students by doing some of the legwork. We just need to keep in mind the fact that the tool will always be likely to make errors and to hallucinate, as we say, to invent information. But provided we are checking that information, then it can save us a lot of time. But we need to think beyond this when we think about AI and education, and particularly when we try to grapple with the complex subject of ethics. So we need to think that, AI in education may not be obvious. It may not always be technology that we can see. So if you look at this picture, it's depicting a teacher with a tablet that's receiving information about all her students, but not just information from their interactions with technology or even from their facial expressions or from what they're saying, but also directly from their brain activity. We know that we can learn a lot from brain activity. So much research has been done in neuroscience that now we are able to make accurate inferences from brain activity about the sorts of things that students are doing within certain areas. So for example, we are able to detect the kind of brain activity that is related to generalizing from across a set of examples. So this means that the student that you might think is looking out of the window could actually be reflecting on what they've just learned and trying to generalize from what they've just learned to what they've learned previously. And that would be a really valuable activity. So the prospect of having data that comes not just from our interactions or physical features of our body, not just from our speech or our facial expressions, but also from what's happening in our brains, and thinking about how AI can be used to analyze all of that data and drive very personalized interactions with students, hopefully orchestrated by a human teacher, then we can see that the future of AI in education may not be clear. And that makes the dilemma when it comes to ethics even harder to approach. So it's always important to remember that for AI, data is the power. Yes, the algorithms, of course, are important, but they're nothing without the data. But that the data that we collect is crude, just like oil is crude when it's drawn from the ground. And it's the way that we refine that data that really matters. And so we must make sure that we refine that data in a way that helps us to understand and visualize the rich complexity of our human intelligence, and particularly the aspects of our human intelligence that are different to what our AI tools are able to provide for us. So, for example, what I refer to as meta-intelligence, the kinds of intelligence that allows us to reflect on our own thinking, to reflect on our own emotions, our own subjective experience of the world, and to interpret the subjective experience of others with whom we're working. The meta-intelligence that allows us to understand our context, our physical context, our digital context, our implied context, as we move seamlessly through the world in a way that our AI peers find impossible at the moment. And then there's that very valuable perceived self-efficacy, that if we develop these advanced thinking skills, we can become very self-effective and can accurately understand what we do and don't know, what we do and don't need to learn in order to achieve our goals, how we might learn, who might help us. These really advanced, sophisticated, higher order thinking skills are the focus that we should be attending to when it comes to education, and in particular, using our AI to help us analyze the data, that rich data that we can collect as we learn and interact in the world. And of course, there are the other three elements of human intelligence that are on the other side of the screen: interdisciplinary academic intelligence, meta-knowing, by which I mean epistemology, understanding what knowledge is and where it comes from, and social intelligence. Now, aspects of this part of our own human intelligence are open to AI. AI certainly isn't socially intelligent, but it can make a good effort at looking to be socially intelligent. And it can certainly develop some of the aspects of meta-knowing, but not all of them. And it is very, very good at that interdisciplinary academic intelligence, but has no ability when it comes to the meta intelligences that set humans apart. And so it's these that we need to focus on as we think about the future of AI in education. And it really is the case that the answer to the future of AI in education is in our hands, and we need to think about it very carefully. Now, for the second part of this talk, I want to think about the implications that that brings for ethics, because I think that's extremely important. Now, in 2018, I co-founded the Institute for Ethical AI in Education with Sir Anthony Seldon and Priya Lakhani, a social entrepreneur who is the founder of Century Tech, the maker of an AI system that's used in schools and colleges across the world. Now, we formed the Institute for Ethical AI in Education in 2018 because we were concerned that whilst there was a lot of attention being paid to ethics and AI and data and ethics, it wasn't specifically focused on education. And we felt education was a special area that needed special attention. And so we worked over a period of years, 2.5 years to be precise, to get a sense of what the educational community and the AI community had to say about ethics and AI in education. And we used this to create a framework. We wanted to produce something very practical that could be used by educators who were thinking of engaging with AI. And so we produced a very practical framework. I don't expect you to be able to read all of this, and it's in English. But what I want to say to you is the framework is constructed around a set of objectives, each of which has a set of criteria. And for each criteria, there is a checklist item. And so the idea is that an educator who is thinking of using AI can use the checklist as a tool to ask themselves questions, their colleagues questions, and indeed the person who's trying to sell them an AI product or service questions, to ensure that they are addressing the ethical needs of their students and the ethical ramifications of introducing AI into the curriculum. And so you can see there are a set of objectives. The first one is achieving educational goals. The second is looking at forms of assessment. The third is administration and workload. The fourth is privacy. The fifth is equity. The sixth is autonomy. The seventh is transparency and accountability. The eighth is informed participation, super important, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a minute. And the ninth is ethical design. So if we just take that ninth objective for a moment, we can see that the ethical design objective is about AI resources should be designed by people who understand the impacts these resources will have. And for each of our objectives in the framework, we provide the evidence behind the creation of this objective within the appendix of the framework. And the framework is freely downloadable from the University of Buckingham's website. I can provide the link afterwards if you would like it. And for this ethical design objective, we have a set of 3 criteria. The first is that the person who's thinking of introducing AI should insist that suppliers of that AI provide relevant information to confirm that a range of stakeholders, such as learners, educators, careers advisors, youth workers, were consulted as part of the design process of their product or service. Secondly, that the person interested in introducing AI should insist that suppliers provide relevant information to confirm that a diverse range of people contributed to the design and development of the AI resource. And thirdly, they should ensure that the supplier can confirm that AI resources were designed by designed by practitioners who have had training on the ethical implications of AI in education. So by setting these standards for the people who are introducing AI, we in turn set standards for the people who are designing and building the AI, because if the customers are demanding to know that these things have been addressed, then the hope is that the supplier will ensure that these things are addressed. And so the checklist for those three criteria, the first one, which is about insisting suppliers provide relevant information to confirm that a range of stakeholders were consulted as part of the design process, the checklist item is, what information have you received from the suppliers, and are you satisfied that a range of stakeholders were consulted? So that's a question for pre-procurement. All of these questions are appropriately addressed by educators at the pre-procurement stage. The second criteria translates into a checklist item of, what information have you received from the suppliers, and are you satisfied that a diverse range of people contributed to the design of the AI resource? And the third checklist item is, what information have you received from the suppliers, and are you satisfied that AI resources were designed by practitioners who have had training on the ethical implications of AI in education? So hopefully you can see that this framework is a very practical tool for teachers and those in charge of buying in technology to organisations such as schools and universities to use as a practical tool to guide them as they interact with suppliers. But what's been interesting post the publication of that framework, that framework was published in 2020, is to see how organisations have taken that framework and tried to use it to inform the processes that they put in place to ensure the ethical adoption and use of artificial intelligence. So these next slides are about a case study conducted with Nord Anglia Education, which is a large school group, has 86 schools across the globe. And they wanted to use the framework to inform the way in which they used AI across their school group. And so it was really interesting to work with them. They're present in 31 countries, and of course those countries will all have different views on ethics, data and AI. There 10,000 teachers work for Nord Anglia Education, and there are 70,000 students. So they're a very large organisation in the education space. And they embarked 3 years ago on a journey to develop digital Nord Anglia. And as part of that, they wanted to put in place the right processes to ensure that whatever they did with digital Nord Anglia was done in an ethical manner. So the data ethics aspects of Project Digital Nord Anglia, Project DNA, were that data enhanced technology and learning involving the collection of large-scale learner data sets that have the potential to improve the quality of the school's education and improve outcomes for current and future students need to be recognised. And the organisation was very keen that it would be ethical for as much benefit for their students, but also benefit for students outside of their organisation could be gained from the learning that Nord Anglia was able to gain from these large data sets. So they needed to ensure that whatever they did with this data was ethical. And they also wanted to make sure that leaders across the Nord Anglia schools knew what was going on and what could be done in order to ensure that the way in which AI was used in their particular school was ethically grounded. And it was important to note for this Digital Nord Anglia project, there was an aspiration that data ethics would be enacted through a set of living practices. And this is really important. And I'll say a little bit more about it in a moment. A set of living practices that encourage the prioritization of students' data rights, well-being and learning experiences and ensure that the collection and use of learner data plus children's interests comes first. And this aspect of developing a set of living practices is extremely important because, of course, this work was all conducted before the release of ChatGPT. And that release that developed this freely available scaled AI does change the landscape in AI in education, because it means that everybody who has access to technology and an internet connection now can have access to sophisticated artificial intelligence. And we don't know what the real implications of that will be. We're watching it play out at the moment. And so it would be very hard to, in advance, ensure that you have the right ethical framework and practices in place that will enable you to deal with anything that happens in the world of AI. So it's really important that you develop living practices that can develop with whatever AI comes along. So this desire for living practices that was instantiated in the work done with North Anglia Education was instantiated back in 2020, and yet it is now that you can see the real importance of that focus on living practices. So what does that mean? Well, as you can see, as part of this case study, just as in the work of the Institute for Ethical AI in Education, what was fundamentally important was working with the community. That community, that large community of over 80 schools, 10,000 teachers, 70,000 students. How do we engage appropriate stakeholders to ensure that we have a representation from across that community? So that was extremely important, to have that stakeholder engagement piece. Then from that, working groups and steering groups were developed, and as part of those working groups and an overseeing steering group, workshops and focus groups were designed. And a lot was learned in those workshops and those focus groups, which enabled the working and steering groups to talk to a whole range of different people from across the schools. And then it was important that as an organisation, they explored the kinds of technology that might be those that we use to enable digital North Anglia, that they explored different AI technologies, and indeed that part of the work of the workshops and the focus groups was looking at different types of AI technology. And so, as you can see from this, which has nicely been translated into Russian, so hopefully is more accessible, they developed their own overview from that original framework, from the work done with the stakeholder groups, through workshops, focus groups, feeding back into those working groups, and then to the steering group. They developed their version of the data ethics framework. And this is an overview. And you can see that accountability, transparency, and responsible innovation are the key pillars that are part of this framework. And we'll look at one of these in a little bit more detail in a moment. But I think it's important to recognize that within the accountability piece is something very important. And this is particularly true in schools, but also true in other educational establishments. This idea of security, safeguarding, and governance are crucial to any kind of ethical framework and any set of ethical processes if it's really going to have an impact on that organisation. And then transparency, which we know from years of work looking at ethics and AI, is supremely important. But that transparency must come with a purpose. It must come with user agency, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in a moment. And it must come with age appropriateness. And then finally, in terms of that responsible innovation piece, remembering that here was an organisation who wanted to be innovative, who wanted to develop digital North Anglia as a project, a programme that leveraged AI and data effectively to support teaching and learning. So in terms of responsible innovation, co-creation was fundamental. enabling that community to be part of the design of the way in which Digital Nord Anglia evolved. Fairness was extremely important. They wanted to ensure that that Digital Nord Anglia provided just and non-discriminatory outcomes for students. And they wanted it to be innovative. One of the key imperatives behind the formation of the Institute for Ethical AI in Education that I believe was embraced by Nord Anglia in this case study was that it would be unethical to prevent students and teachers from benefiting from what AI could offer them. And so a key aspiration of our work was to come up with a way in which we could ensure that people would be able to benefit from what AI had to offer by reducing the risks that are inherent in this kind of technology. And that innovative aspect was very much embraced by this organization who wanted to take the work of the Institute forward. But if we look particularly at the user agency piece, because I think it is particularly interesting. So this was about giving students maximum possible control and about giving them some autonomy over the way in which they interacted with AI. And particularly with respect to their data, to give them agency over who could see their data and how it was used, to help teachers understand enough, to have the knowledge and the skills to interpret and act on learner data to enhance their students' learning experiences. Now, those learning experiences were particularly grounded in metacognition because as an organization, Nord Anglia had decided that metacognition was a key imperative of their teaching. And so it was really important that there was user agency with respect to data that was being used as part of this Digital Nord Anglia program, which focused on developing metacognition in students. And it was important that students and teachers were part of that process of developing the technology, of developing the ways in which data were being used, and principally that students had some agency over what was happening with their data and the way that they were interacting with AI. This is a great aspiration, but how do you actually achieve that in practice? And so user agency took three themes. We needed to look at teachers, we needed to look at parents, and we also needed to look at students. So when it came to user agency, there were those three lenses through which the concept of user agency was explored. So for students, we concluded through the work of the focus groups and workshops that to create good user agency for students, you might invite them to co-design workshops for Digital Nord Anglia as a program. You might use the way in which you roll out Digital Nord Anglia lessons to explain how the technology uses data and the choices that students have. Now, obviously, students of different ages require a different level of support in order to be able to make such decisions. And for much younger students, they're not in a place where they can make those decisions themselves. But as students get older, there's a real opportunity when using AI to help students understand more about AI and more about the way that it uses their data. Another way that we concluded you could introduce user agency for students was introducing bite-sized explanations about data as part of their learning journey. A great way forward is to help students be part of the process of designing the informed consent forms that they use. And also ensuring that students can opt in whenever there are changes to the way their data is being used, and indeed opt out. So it needs to be something where users have some kind of agency. As I say, that user agency is not practical with very young children, but as students get older, then you can certainly look at these principles as a way of introducing user agency. Now, when it comes to teachers, then again, and this is true for teachers across all age ranges in schools, colleges, and universities, you need to invite them to be part of co-design workshops for the AI that's being introduced. You need to give them control over what other people can see, particularly students and parents. You need to provide administrative support in the event of increased communications about data, because teachers are not necessarily equipped to deal with a particular data issue. So they will need support, and they need to have confidence that that support will be there. Provide clear policies and guidance for what to do when things go wrong, so that teachers will feel that they can use the technology with confidence because they know what it is they would need to do if something went wrong. Provide training and explanations for how the technology is used. Create opportunities for reflection and professional development, and allow teachers to add contextual data to the way that the data is fed back to them for the system. And interestingly, I can say, having worked with this group in the years since they did this original work on ethics, they have certainly gone to a huge amount of trouble to provide clear policies and guidance, to provide a lot of training and explanations, and you can see it bearing fruit. It's much more effective for AI in education to be in the hands of educators who feel confident using it, feel they have the knowledge and the skills to use it appropriately, and they are part of the way that it's being introduced. And that's really coming through in the work that's happened with this school organisation since they originally framed this desire for user agency. And finally, when it comes to parents, or this could be other stakeholders in an organisation dealing with older students, establishing a strand of the project that is particular for them, that feeds back particularly to them. This could be for school leaders, could be for education leaders, could be for university leaders, department heads, not just parents. Written guidance, engage them in discussions about what's going on, and particularly the teaching and learning imperative behind the way that the AI is being introduced. Try to consider carefully language. This is super important for helping non-technical people understand enough about AI to feel confident about its use for themselves, for their students, for their colleagues, is to make sure that the language is language that avoids jargon and is formed in a way that's understandable for the audience. And again, giving some control, having some control over what is being done to you, for you, with you when it comes to AI is supremely important when it comes to the ethical dilemma. So the outcome of this particular case study was that the organisation had a focus on embedding ethics into the development pipeline, so into the way that they developed, the way technology was being rolled out, and that was extremely important. We know that AI practitioners often experience a disconnect between the ethical codes available to them and practical standards that would make ethics relatable and actionable. So it's really important that it's embedded throughout the development pipeline. It's essential that processes are in place to regularly verify and evaluate whether the way that you've operationalized this ethical framework and the commitments is actually successful, and whether it's able to be adopted and enable people to react swiftly enough. And it was important that there was a focus on user impact over user need. What is the impact? What's the significant amount of attention that has and will continue to be directed towards user research and engagement of that key stakeholder group? As I said, these have to be living policies. It's not a one hit. It has to be something that goes on. And so that continued engagement and communication is fundamental to any success. And although this was a case study from a school group, this is a school group that runs from 5 years to 18 years, it's equally applicable and adaptable for educational organisations, for other age students, for colleges and for universities. The approach is universal, the specifics are different, the language is different, the stakeholders are different. And so I just wanted to finish with some useful links. I hope these will be useful. So my most recent publication is AI for School Teachers, which is an attempt to write about artificial intelligence in a way that's understandable for educators who have no technical understanding. And therefore, I wrote it with a couple of colleagues, one of whom is a head teacher of a school, to try and not a technical expert, in order to try and make sure that the language was appropriate. We also have some free resources on the website that you can look at, and this book, Machine Learning and Human Intelligence, unfortunately not translated into Russian, sorry about that, lays out the rationale for the way in which I've talked to you about human intelligence and the different elements of our human intelligence, in particular that meta-intelligence that I've spoken about. Thank you very much for listening to me today. I hope that's been useful and interesting for you, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you have.